Welcome to the Ticktective podcast and video series, a program of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation, where our mission is to make Lyme disease easy to diagnose and simple to cure. I'm your host, Leah Gertner, Director of Education and Outreach. Lyme disease is the most common vector-borne disease in the USA and is a global issue. This show includes interviews with the researchers we fund, as well as other interesting people in the Lyme scientific community. We are a nonprofit foundation based in Silicon Valley. Thanks to a generous grant that covers all of our overhead, 100% of all donations go directly to support research and prevention programs. You can find out more or donate at bayarealyme.org. Thank you, Wendy, for joining us on the Ticktective video and podcast series. I appreciate you being here today.
Great to be here.
Wendy Adams is the Research Grant Director at the Bay Area Lyme Foundation, where she serves on the advisory board. She is also a co-founder and board member of the Lyme Disease Biobank. Wendy leads the grant-making process at the Bay Area Lyme Foundation, where she identifies, vets, and monitors progress on scientific projects funded by the Bay Area Lyme Foundation. Wendy has spent over 20 years in the biotechnology field and worked in business development, strategy, and finance for companies in infectious and autoimmune disease, vaccines, oncology, drug delivery, and neurology. Wendy holds an AB from Duke University and an MBA from the Haas School of Business at the University of California at Berkeley, where she also served on the faculty in entrepreneurship. Wendy has served as a member and subcommittee member of the Health and Human Services Tick-borne Disease Working Group Federal Advisory Committee since 2017. She also serves as a programmatic reviewer for the Department of Defense congressionally directed medical research program in tick-borne disease. And I was hoping that you could start out just telling our listeners a little bit about how you pivoted from working with biotech researchers to working with tick-borne disease researchers.
Yeah, so I have always loved working in biotech because I loved working in a diverse group of people who had different ways of approaching things, different academic backgrounds, and different ways of working a problem. And so despite the fact that I did not have a scientific undergrad, I have really enjoyed this great long career in biotech. However, I did get sick early on in that career, and it took several years, like most people, to get diagnosed. And when I was diagnosed, I started thinking about this because I thought, how does this happen? Like, how was I misdiagnosed for so many years? And so I started to do some research. When I started feeling better, obviously, I started to do research and figure out what had happened and why this was happening to me and other people. And I, kind of promised myself I would engage more when I was really feeling better. And through this process, I met Bonnie Crater, who was just thinking about starting Bay Area Lyme at the time, along with other people in Portola Valley, our co-founders, Lori Woods, and among them. And when the foundation was started, I started working, but just on a kind of a one-day-a-week basis. And I was still really heavily involved in the biotech industry. And I loved it, and I loved being able to do both. But at some point, it became clear to me that really where I was needed the most was in the tick-borne disease community, because I had a kind of unique background as somebody who had been a patient, but had also worked in drug delivery and drug discovery for years and years, and knew what that process was like, knew how to approach scientific problems and to work on solving them, and to work on communicating what was happening in the scientific community to people who weren't scientists or weren't involved in that particular research. And so that's how I got involved. So at that point, I basically said, okay, I'm going to do tick-borne disease research, advocacy, management, sourcing for my career, because that's where I feel the most passion.
Well, we're so lucky that you pivoted our direction and came to the Bay Area Lyme Foundation, because your scientific mind and your ability to hold on to really complex concepts and facts always astonishes me. So I know that the Bay Area Lyme Foundation has funded over 100 projects at 37 institutions, and probably more than that now, across the USA. And that you have been involved in helping to select and monitor these research projects over the past 7 years. And I know that the VC model is what makes this program so innovative. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that VC model that we use to bring research to the forefront in the tick-borne disease community.
a lot of people have given money in tick-borne diseases to research. However, there wasn't that accountability. And there was, a lot of I call them donor refugees, right? People who had given significant amounts of money to institutions, but didn't really have the research that they were, told they were going to have for that amount of money. And so what I think our value, in large part to especially, large donors, is to say, okay, well, we're going to handle that for you. We will handle the accountability part for you. And we will make sure that the researchers are, doing what they say they're going to do, which is really important. And the researchers are incredibly passionate about the work they do. But I think they like this accountability as well, because it helps them tie the funding to what they're doing. And they also know with that accountability comes, a much bigger chance that if they are successful in those endeavors, then they'll get follow-on funding, right? So it's a way to build the relationship. It builds in touch points along the research timeline. And it's also a chance for us to, sometimes we'll give feedback, like, have you thought about this? Or have you talked about to this person because they're doing something similar? Or did you read this paper that maybe touches on what you were doing? Because we're talking to a lot of the researchers doing similar things at the same time. So I think the VC model for us is accountability and staying close to our researchers and making sure we have a good relationship with them, making sure they're collaborating as well with other researchers that either that we're funding or that we're not funding, so that people aren't doing the same experiments over and over and not talking about their failures and their successes. Science can be competitive, so you have to respect when people don't want to talk about what they're doing for competitive reasons. We understand that, and we keep everything confidential. But oftentimes we can be really helpful in the design of a protocol, because we can just bring up things that especially new researchers might not have thought of to Lyme disease. So that's the kind of innovation VC model where we stay close, we tie funding to milestones, and we make sure that there's collaboration across researchers.
I agree, Wendy. I feel like if you're a scientist and you're really specialized in your little niche, that it's sometimes hard to know what else is happening or to have time to research what else is happening with other researchers across the US. I know that the Bay Area Lyme Foundation funded the first ever West Coast Tick-borne disease conference at Stanford recently in conjunction with Harvard's Massachusetts General Hospital. And that was an opportunity for researchers to present some of their findings and come together physically before coronavirus and communicate and share ideas. And so I think it is really an interesting and important service that the Bay Area Lyme Foundation offers with that VC model. I'm wondering what some of your favorite projects were. I wanted to ask you first about maybe the most innovative project. Do you have something off the top of your head?
The most recent thing we funded is really interesting, and that is using wearables, so an Apple Watch or a Fitbit, to diagnose Lyme disease or to monitor chronic patient symptoms and to see if there is a corroboration between symptomology and biochemical reactions. So this is something out of Stanford that is using the ability of the Fitbit and the Apple Watch to measure things like now pulse oximetry and heart rate, to see if we can use that modality to diagnose disease or to measure what's happening when people are sick. And I think that's really exciting, because the installed base of these watches is huge, right? So if you could build in an algorithm that would diagnose people before they even knew they were sick. And this actually happened because the researcher, who's the chair of genetics at Stanford, was able to see his diagnosis of Lyme disease in his numbers that he was keeping track of as part of his own paper. And this was published in PLOS One, but he had been bitten by a tick in Massachusetts. He didn't know he had been bitten, but he knew he was outside in Massachusetts. And then he flew to Norway, and he could watch himself. He knew he wasn't getting the same oxygen, and he knew his heart rate wasn't acting like it usually does when he was on the flight, and he wondered why. And he also wasn't feeling well. When he got to Norway, he was diagnosed with Lyme, but he could go back and actually look and see how it changed, how it diverged from his normal readings in those areas. So that's something that's really exciting, because that could be kind of a passive population-based diagnosis tool, as opposed to having to actually know you're sick and then go into the doctor to get a test.
Right, that's exciting. I know my husband is really obsessed with the Aura Ring and all of the external sensors for health.
Mm-hmm.
So using it for prediction and diagnostics is a very innovative idea. I'm wondering about maybe the most impactful study, which I'm going to guess was probably out of Tulane, but I wanted to know a little bit more what you have to say about that.
Oh, wow. There are a lot, but the Tulane study, yes, was big. And we've funded Dr. Embers to look at persistence in the rhesus macaque model. So Dr. Embers' study, to which you allude at Tulane, was really interesting and exciting, and certainly really impactful in that you saw how difficult it was to find Borrelia in an animal after it had been infected and then treated. But what was really interesting in that study is how she found the Borrelia. She had to take tissue from a monkey and put it into a rat. And once the tissue was in a rat, the spirochetes that were in the tissue from the monkey started growing again. But they didn't start growing just taking the tissue out and looking for the DNA. They basically waited till they were back in another mammal, and then they started growing again. So that's a really interesting look into Borrelia and how, it's called fastidious, how it is so particular about its environment that it can just shut down and not grow again until it sees the conditions that it likes, which is a mammalian growth system. So that was really, really interesting. And it just goes to show how different Borrelia is, and Treponema too, because Treponema is another spirochete, and that's the spirochete that causes syphilis, is that you can't just put it into a dish and expect it to grow, especially once it comes out or once it's been antibiotic treated. It won't necessarily, and you have to go put it back into another system to get it to grow again. And Treponema is really interesting because it's never been cultured at all. Recently it has been. They think they've come up with a culture system, but it really wouldn't grow outside of a mammal. So these are just things that make spirochetes kind of particularly difficult to study.
I think supporting that persistence research was very timely for the Bay Area Lyme Foundation, because there's been so much discussion about persistence in Lyme disease recently.
And let me just, in the same vein that Dr. Embers' work was so important, we funded some similar work, but in mice at UC Davis. And this was done by Dr. Amir Hadzik, who had done a lot of the early mouse work with Stephen Barthold. And his hypothesis was that it wasn't going to matter. So the original research showed that really out to 12 months, Borrelia could be found in a treated mouse. So even 12 months after infection, it could be found. And that it actually would resurge. So you wouldn't find it for months and months, and then at 12 months it would come back, and you'd see a PCR positive of OSPA in like joint tissue. And so he said, I want to do that study, but I want to go out longer. I want to go out to 18 months, and I want to do it with different strains of Borrelia. So he used N40 and B31, I think, and he used 2 strains of mice. And he found the same thing, basically, is that number one, he could find it out to 18 months, that these Borrelia didn't die, but they would resurge. They just had been quiescent. They had just gone to sleep for a while, weren't metabolically active, and that it didn't matter which strain it was of either mice or of the bacteria. So it didn't matter. So it wasn't a strain-dependent phenotype, and it wasn't a mouse strain dependent phenotype. So it was much more broad, that you could say that now found this 18 months later. So I think that was important and a little bit underappreciated, just because it took something that was found a while ago that Stephen Barthold and Amir Hadzik had done and expanded upon it and said, okay, well, if this is what we found, is this, if we play around with this, if we put some more detail around what we're looking for, is the phenomenon consistent, or is it, because of the strain of mice we're using or the strain of bacteria we're using? The answer was no, it was pretty generalizable.
I think it's so important to have science settle some of these debates. I mean, science speaks for itself, and good research from good quality institutions really can settle a debate like this to some degree if the information gets out there, which I hope it keeps getting out there.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the critique, and it's a somewhat valid one, is that mice are the reservoir species, right? So what happens in mice is not necessarily extrapolatable to man because we're a dead end host. I think you can take that somewhat. You can take that with, you know, that's a fair criticism. But, you know, the truth is we look at mouse studies all the time for every different disease. And so that's what we have, and that's the best model we have to evaluate this. So just because it's happening in mice doesn't mean it's not happening in humans, but we do take it with somewhat of a grain of salt just because it's in a reservoir species, and we know a mouse immune system does not eradicate Borrelia just on its own.
But the Tulane study was not in mice, right?
Nope, the Tulane study was not in mice. That was in non-human primates. So that is a much better model, although it's unfortunately a much harder model, and it's much more expensive to do those kind of studies. It would be cost prohibitive to do that study in non-human primates.
In terms of ticks, I feel like the free tick testing study, the Citizen Science Project, was very successful. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that was really interesting. And of course, you know, Nate Nieto was the lead author of that, and he passed away sadly about a year ago. But the work lives on, and it's really impressive. And so what they found is that, number one, the tick that is responsible for passing Lyme disease, passing Borrelia, is actually in over 50% of the counties in the US. And so we didn't get ticks from all those counties. So that was interesting. He found Borrelia burgdorferi in places that they weren't expecting to see it. And one of the really interesting places they found it in was larvae. Now, Borrelia is supposed to be picked up by a tick after its first infection, after its first blood meal. It's not supposed to be transmitted transovarially, so from a mother tick to the egg. However, he did find it. He found it in larvae. Now, not often and not a lot, but nonetheless, he did. He was very confident in that finding, and he found it because, you know, people send in these female ticks, and many of them were pregnant, and they, you know, laid eggs in these containers that he was sent. So he wasn't expecting to be able to do that kind of research, but he was able to. So that was a key finding. And then he did find Borrelia species in like Lone Star ticks. And so that was interesting. There have been people who have found Borrelia in Lone Star ticks before. We don't know whether or not they pass a Borrelia infection to a Lone Star tick, although, you know, people say that there's a Borrelia Lone Stari, that positive agent of Stari. But that was an interesting finding. The other thing that he found that was really interesting is he did find Lone Star ticks in California from two separate properties, two separate envelopes of Lone Star ticks. And I think others have found Lone Star ticks as well on the north coast of California. So that does not comport with anybody's understanding of the Lone Star tick. But he did, you know, he found that. Now, whether or not you could say, well, did somebody bring it back from traveling? You know, had they been on the East Coast or somewhere that Lone Stars are endemic? And that's always a possibility. However, given that he found them from two separate envelopes, two separate people who had sent them in from two separate properties, it kind of speaks to the fact that that's less of a possibility than it is of they're actually on the northern part of California.
And the pathogen that we worry about most with Lone Star ticks would be the alpha-gal allergy.
They pass rickettsia disease, rickettsial infections, and so rickettsia, but also something like Ehrlichia, which is kind of a cousin of anaplasma. So you would want to worry about ehrlichiosis and rickettsiosis, but also alpha-gal tick allergy. But that wouldn't show up for some time. You wouldn't be able to necessarily correlate that with a bite. But
Right.
And, you know, I have heard of other cases of tick anaphylaxis coming from Ixodes pacificus. Even though that's not known to be a major tick that's involved in that. It's really thought to be more of a Midwest, East Coast Europe thing. However, Ixodes pacificus has, I do know of a case where that happened.
So speaking of Ixodes pacificus and Ixodes scapularis, the tick that is most known to transmit Lyme disease, we both understand too well the tragic consequences that arise when people don't notice their tick bites and thus miss a chance to treat any potential tick-borne infections during the acute phase. And it's even more tragic when someone is lucky enough to spot a diagnostic erythema migrans, a Lyme rash, but then it is sadly misdiagnosed. We both know there are countless stories of medical providers misdiagnosing tick bites and Lyme erythema migrans rashes. Sometimes they get misdiagnosed as ringworm or a rash of unknown origin. But it seems like the biggest problem is that there's a lack of disseminated information about the fact that A, most people who contract Lyme disease from a tick bite don't even develop a rash. And two, the rash is generally not the typical bullseye rash. It's more likely going to be a solid red oval rash. So if a bullseye rash is more the exception and not the rule, but medical providers are taught that a bullseye rash is the only way to diagnose Lyme disease outside of a lab, then we have a problem. And I'm just wondering, why is there so much misinformation out there? And what can we do to raise awareness about the actual frequency and presentation of Lyme erythema migrans rashes so that people can get properly diagnosed in time to be successfully treated?
This mischaracterization of an EM rash as just a bullseye is so frustrating and annoying. We know from studies that it is a cause of misdiagnosis frequently. And I think the biggest misdiagnosis you hear is of kind of the cellulitis, which is another infection. The problem is if you diagnose an EM with cellulitis, you give antibiotics that don't work for Lyme disease. And so that prolongs the time to the correct diagnosis, but also puts you at a much higher risk of post-treatment persistent Lyme disease because of the delay in the correct treatment and treating it with incorrect antibiotics. So this is something we found in medical textbooks, in official NIH documents, official FDA documents, official documents in state departments of health, and I hear it in lectures. We've seen it in scientific, peer-reviewed papers. It's referred to incorrectly, and including case reports. And actually, a couple of case reports have been printed or written recently. Dr. Baranchuk, who's the cardiologist at Kingston University, he had this problem. He told me about it at our CME conference. He said, oh yeah, I had, even somebody in my own hospital told me they had the cellulitis case, and it wasn't. It was an erythema migrans, but they had misdiagnosed it. And then Dr. Alcott at Hopkins just recently wrote up a case, and this had the double issue of an African-American man who had an erythema migrans that looked like it was just homogenous. And so not only was it homogenous, but it was on darker skin. And so it was misdiagnosed as cellulitis. And it was, the start of his being misdiagnosed several times, despite being on a camping trip and despite having a known insect bite. And he went on to develop persistent Lyme. And you could just see that as the first event in a cascading series of misdiagnoses, and it's so incredibly frustrating. So that, I think, is kind of the bare minimum that we could start to telling doctors about, especially, is that you really need to be able to understand that this hallmark rash that you are looking for and requiring for diagnosis, number one, may not be there, and number two, 5 times out of 6 looks like a different rash. It doesn't look like a bullseye. So if you see a bullseye, you're darn lucky, and you should diagnose it. But just because it's not a bullseye doesn't mean it's not Lyme. And it seems like this should be just the minimum of what our public health system should be able to do, is to get correct information about the identification of a rash out to the doctors that see it on a daily basis during, high season on the East Coast. So that's my pet peeve and a cause celeb for me. I just want to make sure that doctors have the right information so that they don't misdiagnose.
Well, thank you for trying so hard to get the proper information out there to people about what an erythema migrans rash may or may not look like. I also missed it on myself when I had a solid oval rash after a camping trip, and it was unfortunate. So now that everyone in America has heard the word antibody and diagnostics and pathogen, and has figured out that the CDC and the government may not hold all the answers for these kinds of diseases or pandemics. How do you think the COVID-19 pandemic will inform the Lyme pandemic?
So that's a great question. And I think it's been hard for us. Obviously, so many people are going through so much. So we try and put things in perspective. We obviously have a lot of researchers who are doing work in diagnostics and infectious diseases. So many of them have transferred to COVID for the time being, and we understand that. And in many cases, we think it'll be helpful because the money and the investment and the time that's going to develop the technologies that we think will be helpful in diagnosing Lyme disease are being used and developed for COVID. And so we are hoping that for tick-borne infections, we can piggyback off the work and the development time and money and effort that's being spent on COVID diagnostics and bring them to Lyme and tick-borne diseases. But I think the bigger question is, these COVID long haulers and the people who aren't getting better, who have an acute infection and then end up with a long-term illness is it's sad, and it's something that we're so familiar with. Many people with Lyme don't get better or have, continued symptomology. And so understanding how those two perhaps fit together, will people study the COVID long haulers? They already have started, but will that information be useful to us in studying why people with Lyme disease aren't getting better? We hope so, but certainly more people have been studying Lyme for longer than COVID. So I think it remains to be seen how those two overlap, but the symptomology is almost exactly the same with the exception of respiratory disease, which COVID long haulers seem to have, and persistent Lyme patients don't seem to have as a rule. So understanding the overlap there will be interesting.
Well, thank you, Wendy Adams, for joining us on the Ticktective podcast and video series. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here. Thanks, Leah.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Ticktective podcast and video series, a program of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation. You can find out more or donate at bayarealyme.org.